He is Herod the Great because he's the only man on earth that did not fall in love with Cleopatra the seventh. Right? Antony had, Julius Caesar had, almost everyone had fallen in love with Cleopatra the seventh, but Herod did not. Today gets exciting. We're going to talk about somebody you know about already, Herod the Great. Everybody else, we didn't know much about him. Alexander the Great, we know kind of about him a little bit. Antiochus Epiphanes, really never knew him till we talked about him. But Herod the Great, oh boy, do we know Herod the Great. But let me tell you the rest of the story of Herod the Great. We're going to do that today. We're actually going to take two times to talk about Herod the Great, because we're going to talk about not just Herod the Great, but also his siblings and his sons who came along, and how he really dictated what the kingdom looked like from that point on. Of course, he was under the control of Rome. He was under the auspices of Rome, of the Roman emperor. So he had only a certain number of things that he could do, but he was a very strong ruler. Okay? So, the term Herod the Great, I kind of kid around about Herod the so-so and Herod the mediocre and whatever Herod the Great. But Herod the Great really is not a term that probably he used in his time. It's possible. I mean, he may have had, because he had precedents, right? He had Alexander the Great that was already being written about in the history books. So he probably envisioned himself as Herod the Great. So he may have possibly had his subjects call him Herod the Great. We don't see really evidence of that until Josephus in his Antiquities of the Jews in chapter 18, when he wrote in about AD 93 or 94, when he used the term Herod the Great. Now, Josephus, I've read his works, and he's mentioned Herod 100,000 times. Well, okay, a few times, hundreds of times probably. Only once did he mention the name Herod the Great. Now, the way ancient writers did, when you talked about Herod the Great, you talked about him being the head of the family, okay? Because Herod had other kids, Herod Antipas, Herod Archelaus, etc., okay? So Herod the Great was Herod number one, or Herod the Greater, or Herod the Older, or Herod the Great for short. Now, I'll use an example of today, modern times, George Foreman, the Great. Well, if somebody 2,000 years from now, if I wrote something about George Foreman, if I wrote a book on George Foreman, and I said George Foreman the Great, I would probably write the fact that he was the Great because he was a great fighter, right? The Great. But he was the father of 12 kids, 2 adopted. 5 of those boys were named George Foreman. Did you know that? How do you keep those straight? Well, he had different nicknames for these kids, okay? But they were all named George Foreman. So if I'm writing today about George Foreman, I might call him George Foreman the Great. Somebody 2,000 years ago from now might look back on that and say, well, I was writing about George Foreman the Great because he was the papa of the other 5 kids named George Foreman. That's what Josephus was writing. Herod the Great, Herod the Greater, Herod the Older, Herod number 1, okay? If you've looked at the book, I don't remember what pages it's on right now, but in the 200s somewhere, if you've looked at the book, at the family trees of Herod, it's a mess. The family trees of the Seleucids and the Ptolemies were actually pretty simple compared to the family tree of Herod the Great. I tried my best to get it on one page, and I couldn't do it. So I ended up with 2 different charts, 2 different plots of his family tree. Okay, that makes it real confusing. That we'll see in just a minute. So I did a couple of charts, 2 or 3 charts here to really simplify things. This first chart is just the siblings of Herod the Great. So Herod the Great had 3 brothers, Phasio first, Joseph and Pheroras, and 1 sister, Salome. Salome was faithful up until Herod the Great died. In fact, Salome got a piece of the kingdom. We don't think about that very often, but she got a piece of the kingdom. We know that Herod Archelaus got a piece, right? We know that Philip got a piece, right? We know that Antipas got a piece. He was the tetrarch over Galilee, right? During the trials of Jesus, Jesus went to him as tetrarch of Galilee. Okay? So all these sons got pieces of the kingdom, but Salome got a piece also because she was faithful up until the death of Herod. Phasio I, we talked about him a little bit last week. He tried to kill himself when captured by the Parthians. He was successful ultimately. It was like a slow-motion suicide. He was bound, and he couldn't do anything, but he saw a rock there, and he tried to bash his head against it and whatever, and he just injured himself real bad and ended up dying later. We don't know if he was poisoned by Antigonus or not. or just succumbed to his wounds. Joseph was killed in 38 BC by forces of Antigonus II. Okay, there was a civil war going on between, we're going to talk about this a lot, between Herod the Great and Antigonus II, one of the Hasmoneans. And I'm going to show you the family. I know you've seen the family tree 100 times, but I want to show you exactly who he was one more time. Okay, Herod the Great, Antigonus II, civil war. So Joseph was killed in 38. Pheroras lived a good long time. Okay, he lived so long that he was in a conspiracy about the time Herod actually did die in killing Herod. Okay, I will talk about that a little bit later on too. That conspiracy was headed up by one of Herod's sons, his eldest son, in fact, Antipater III, his eldest son by his wife Doris. Okay, a great big conspiracy. It involved a lot of people, and Herod ended up having to kill a lot of his family because of it, and banished a lot of them or whatever. But this great conspiracy Pheroras was involved in. So those are the brothers and sister of Herod the Great. Another simple tree is the wives and children of Herod the Great. Wife number 1, Doris. Son number 1, Antipater III, named after Antipater II, Herod's father, and named after Antipater I, Herod's grandfather. Okay. Wife number 2, Mariamne I, had 4 kids. 2 daughters, don't care. Daughters didn't matter to anything back then, basically. But 2 sons, Aristobulus IV and Alexander, were killed by Herod the Great in 7 BC. They were taken to trial and killed by Herod the Great. His 2 kids, he killed them. I'll talk about that in just a minute also. We might talk about that next week. His 3rd wife, Mariamne II. She was somebody he just saw, fell in love with her, and decided to marry her. And instead of just taking her like he could have as king of the Jews, he decided to make her father high priest. Okay, and this actually spawned a whole priesthood, a family of priesthood that we'll read. I'll show you a family tree of that in just a minute also. Okay, he had a 6th wife, 7, 8, 9, 10 wives, bunch of kids, and these kids, oh boy, did they interact in the times to come. We'll talk about that as the time comes along. Now, 2 of the wives, we need to talk about their families, Mariamne I and Mariamne II. Okay? Now, we've seen this chart a bunch of times of the Maccabees and the Hasmoneans. Mariamne I was the great-great-great-great-granddaughter of Papa Mac, Mattathias at the very top of the tree up there. Okay? She was a pure-blood Hasmonean. She was Hasmonean on the left side of the tree, the mom side of the tree, and the right side of the tree, the father side of the tree. Okay? Aristobulus III, her brother, was also a pure Hasmonean from the right side and the left side, from his mom's side and their brother, sister, of course, so the same side of the family. All right. So that's his 2nd wife. His 3rd wife was Mariamne II. Again, she was a woman that he just basically saw, I don't know, whatever, and he decided to make her father, Simon, the high priest in about 23 BC. And he reigned for a couple of years until he was kicked out of the high priesthood when he basically kicked her out. Okay, so that's another family tree that we need to be aware of with Herod the Great. Now, oh dear, it gets complicated. Notice in this chart up here, Herod the Great doesn't have any kids. That's in chart number 2. There's no way, I tried, believe me, I tried. Maybe there is a way, but I need more paper. My book is an 8.5 by 11 book, and I tried my best to get it on an 8.5 to 11 sheet of paper. I could not. That's why it's in 2 different charts, because there's complicated relationships. This brother married this second cousin over here, and just the crossing lines and everything is just too complicated. So anyway, some things to notice about this chart. People who are in a different color, like Herodias here, Cyprus, Olympias, Aristobulus IV, Salampsio, even Herod the Great, those are all over in chart number 2, right here. Same color. Salampsio is in blue here. At the bottom of the chart, she's in blue here, right here. Over here, Aristobulus IV is in green here, and he's in green over here. Okay? So in this chart, it looks like Aristobulus doesn't have any kids. Whereas in this chart, it looks like Herod the Great had a bunch of kids, a bunch of wives, but Aristobulus didn't have any kids. You have to go back to this chart to see the kids that Aristobulus had. Okay? Complex. Now, if I ever redo the book, I'll put those charts, at least if I don't redo it. Hopefully I can redo it and make it work. But if I redo it someday, I will put at best, or at worst, I guess, I'll put them on facing pages so you can see them. Right now, they're on opposite pages. If you looked in the book ahead of time, they're on opposite pages, kind of hard to keep up with. Okay. So, Herod has no wives or children on this chart, but they're on the second chart. And I talked to you about the colors of the ovals between the charts. And you would also think that Herod Agrippa I is not the grandson of Herod the Great, but he is. Okay, so Herod Agrippa I, right here, is the grandson of Herod the Great. But Herod the Great doesn't have any kids coming off him, so he can't have any grandkids. But he does if you go to this chart right here. So, complicated? Yes. Anything I can do about it? I don't think so. There's no way I could put it on a single slide, I don't think, and show you today. You can barely see the names probably the way it is. Okay. Notice another thing about this chart. If I redo it in a second edition of the book, I say these blue boxes are rulers of Judea. Actually not Judea until AD 6. I would probably, if I do a new version, put these guys like Herod Antipas, Philip the Tetrarch, Salome, the other Salome, back here, different Salome. Where is she? Right there. I would probably put them in a different color because they end up being rulers of territories, not Judea, okay? Like Galilee, Perea, whatever, different territories. So I'd probably put them in a different color and show they were actually rulers, but they weren't rulers of Judea like Herod the Great was, okay? Like Herod Agrippa I was, like Herod Agrippa II was. All right. Not much more I can say about that. If you have the book, go look at that and see if you can figure stuff out. Good luck. All right, so Herod the So-So, the early years. Now, we've seen this chart last week, and I want to kind of go back to it and kind of get a feeling for where we stand, okay? So the main people in the chart are Hyrcanus, and we're going to look starting in slice 13, the skinny little blue slice right here, and then on. In this particular chart, we're only going to look at slices 13 and the white slice 14, okay? So Hyrcanus was pretty much out of the picture at this point. Why? Because he had his ears cut off by the Parthians. Remember that from last week, okay? He could no longer be high priest. The requirement of a high priest was you had to be without blemish, without flaw. Having your ears cut off is pretty flawy, right? So he could not any longer be high priest, so he was kind of like an honorary high priest after 440 BC when he had his ears cut off. Phasael, after 40 BC, was no longer in the picture either because he killed himself. Okay? So the only ones we really have in the picture are Antigonus II. Remember who he is. Let's go to the family tree chart again. Antigonus II, right here, he was the son of Aristobulus II, who was the brother of Hyrcanus. These are the two guys that had the civil war where Rome came in under Pompey the Great and took over in 63 BC because of the war of these two brothers. So Antigonus was the son of one of these brothers. Okay? He's the one who's fighting Herod the Great, who's now part of the family because he married Mariamne I. So we have this fight between family members, Antigonus II and Herod the Great. All right. So slices 13 and 14, Antipater, father of Herod the Great, makes Herod the governor of Galilee and Phasael the governor of Jerusalem. Okay, slice 13, this skinny slice right here. Slice 14, Herod is made governor of Cold Syria, and then Antipater was poisoned. So slice 14, this white slice, Herod the Great is now governor of Cold Syria. Antipater is poisoned in the middle of that white slice, and Herod is basically on his own. Now, early in his career, now we're talking about, I'm kind of dividing this between Herod the Great when he had his dad to kind of fall back on, and Herod the Great after his dad died, okay? And I'm kind of kidding around when I say Herod the So-So, because he really was a pretty strong leader even in the early days, even when his dad was living, okay? But in the early days, he was accused of murder. He ended up killing a man without trial who had been terrorizing the Syrians. The Syrians were very glad of this. They were, Herod was their hero. But the Jews wanted this terrorist brought to justice before the Sanhedrin. So Herod was called before the Sanhedrin about 46 BC, we think, and he intimidated the court. This is cool. He brought all this contingent of people dressed in armor and bodyguards. The Sanhedrin's just a bunch of old guys. They're a bunch of old guys, 70 of them, but they're just a bunch of judges. I mean, they're the high court of Israel, right? He really intimidated them. Not only that, but the president, I think Josephus calls them presidents, but the governor of the Syrian province, of which Judea was a sub-province, had also written a letter to the Sanhedrin and said, do not convict this guy. And the Sanhedrin was saying, oh, okay, because Herod's got all these guys with spears and swords and armor, and not a good idea. And also because of the letter that the governor of the Syrian province wrote, he was over the Judean province, okay? He was the main guy, okay? He said, don't convict Herod, but a guy named Samius stood up. He was a great orator, apparently, and he convinced the Sanhedrin, yes, we need to convict this guy. Hyrcanus put off the trial. Hyrcanus was scared. And he said to Herod, you better get out of here because the Sanhedrin's getting ready to convict you. And if they convict you, we don't know. You'll go to jail, you might get killed, we don't know. So get out of here. But Herod put together an army this time, not just his bodyguards, but an army this time, and he came to Hyrcanus and said, now what you going to do? And Hyrcanus said, let's not do a trial for you, Herod. You're an all right kind of guy. About this time, the governor of the Syrian province appointed Herod to be the governor of Cold Syria. That's what we saw in that little time slice earlier. Okay, the next time slices, time slice 15, this blue slice right here, through the end, slice 19. This is after Herod's father's death. Herod and Phaedra became tetrarchs of Judea. Antigonus, with the help of the Parthians, becomes a puppet king in 40 BC. He's put on the throne in Jerusalem as king of the Jews, okay, king of Judea, under the auspices of the Parthian government. Now, I showed you the chart of Parthia earlier, 2 or 3 weeks ago. Parthia was a pretty big empire coming along, okay? Rome was a pretty big empire. Well, you got two big empires, what you going to have? You're going to have a bunch of wars, right? Well, Rome and Parthia were at war, okay? Parthia put Antigonus II on the throne here in Jerusalem, in Judea, from 40 to 37, okay? He was the de facto ruler of Palestine at that time. Okay, let's go back to our time slices. Antigonus becomes high priest in 40 BC. Phasael kills himself in 40. Hyrcanus has his ears cut off. Herod escapes to Rome. Okay, he first went, I'm talking about this in just a minute, but he first went to Cleopatra in Egypt, and then he went to Rome. Okay, there he's named king of the Jews by Mark Antony and the Senate. That's about 40 BC. Herod, slice 17, right here, the skinny little blue slice. Herod defeats Antigonus II, has Mark Antony behead him in 37 BC. Remember, Antigonus was caught and taken back to Rome probably for a triumph. Where they parade people through the streets, say, yay, very we conquered this guy, here he is in chains, ha. Well, Herod paid off Antony and said, that's not a good idea, because remember, Antigonus was a full-blood Hasmonean. And Herod was worried, rightly so, that Antigonus might go before the Roman Senate, before the consuls of Rome, and say, I'm a Hasmonean. I was there a lot longer before Herod ever came along. I should be the king. And Herod was worried that scenario might play out, so he paid Antony a bunch of money and had him killed. So Antigonus was killed pretty much as soon as he got to Rome. Bad news for him, I guess. Ananias becomes the high priest. Ananias is kind of a random guy. Okay, he becomes high priest for a very short time. Slice 18, this skinny white slice, due to the begging of his wife, Mariamne I, and her mother, Alexandra, Herod makes Mariamne's brother, Aristobulus III, the high priest. That didn't last long, lasted about a year or two. Herod then had him drowned and renamed Ananias high priest. I'm going to step you through the fall of Judea by the Parthians. You never think of the Parthians really capturing Judea, but they kind of did. In a very short period of time, from about 40 to 37, when Herod the Great was then was able to take over. Only because of the might of Rome was Herod the Great able to take over. Okay, so this is the original chart in the book on page 220. So if you have that, you can go ahead and turn to that. So the two sides, the Parthians, including a couple of generals, Barzapharnes and Pacorus. Okay, so the Parthians and Antigonus II, who was the son of Aristobulus II that we talked about in the previous chart. On the other side, we had Herod, the mediocre at this point, Hyrcanus II, the high priest, Phasael, his brother, and Joseph, his other brother. Okay? So because of all this run-ins that we're going to talk about in the next few charts, I'm going to break this chart into 13 different charts so you can see it a little better. I know you probably can't see that where it is. So because of all this, Herod ultimately became king of the Jews because of the Romans. All these events I'm about to show you are in 40 BC. So first up, the Parthians under the general Barzapharnes entered Galilee and encamped at Ecdipa. That's bullet number 1 if you're looking in the book. You can see the call-outs there in that one chart. Bullet 2, the Parthians under Prochorus invaded Judea. Now notice that I have the different arrows in different colors. This is the current one I'm talking about right here. It's blue, so this is the travels of Prochorus. All right. And the main event was happening right here in Lydda. Next up, Antigonus II from Jerusalem joined Prochorus in Lydda. Okay, so they're starting to get their strategy together on how they're going to take over Judea. All right, and there's the family tree once again showing who Antigonus II is. Bullet number 4, Hyrcanus II and Phasael were taken captive by the Parthians, held in Ecdippa, and Phasael actually seemed to be a pretty decent guy. Phasael had an opportunity to escape, but he did not because of Hyrcanus still being in captivity. Phasael, a little bit later, committed suicide when he bashed his head against a rock, and then Hyrcanus at this point, somewhere around this time, had his ears cut off. Bullet 5, in Tekoa, Herod escaped Jerusalem with 9,000 of his family, friends, and guards. How many of you have 9,000 friends and family? Maybe Herod the Mediocre is not a good name for him. I don't know. Maybe he was Herod the Great at this point. If you got 9,000 friends and family and guards, man, you're probably doing all right. If I had 9 people I could take with me to the Athens, I'm not sure I could get them. But Herod the Great had 9,000 people. He escaped, and he fled to Tekoa, which is later named Herodian, right here. Okay. At some point, when a wagon turned over on his mother, Herod thought, I'm just done with this. I'm going to commit suicide. Almost killed his mom, Cyprus I. He was stopped by his traveling companions, and they told him it was not the part of a brave man to free himself from the distresses he was in and to overlook his friends that were in the same distress also. Man, what a guilt feeling poor Herod the Great had put on him. You know, if you commit suicide, you're just kind of giving up, and what does that do for us? It leaves all 9,000 of us. What do we do? So they talked him out of committing suicide. Boy, history would have been different if he had gone ahead and committed suicide at this time. Remember, this is all in 40 BC, before things really take off for Herod the Great. Bullet 6, Herod defeated the Jews at Tekoa. Now remember, Herod was fighting Jews. Okay, he was king of the Jews, right? A little bit later on. But he was fighting Jews. He's not king of the Jews yet. So the Jews were pretty much encamped on the side of Antigonus because Antigonus was a Hasmonean. He was a rightful leader of this. Remember the leader and high priest forever under Simon, the Maccabee, who was also the Hasmonean. Well, if you're a leader and high priest forever, then your progeny should be leaders and high priests forever too, right? So the Jews were, for the most part, all in on Antigonus II being the leader, okay? So he defeated the Jews at Tekoa, and later on he built Herodium as a monument to his victory. And there's a picture of Herodium right there. We did not see Herodium when we were in Israel. I wanted to, but it's over in the West Bank. And there's some dicey stuff about going over on the West Bank. But we could see it. We were standing up on either the Mount of Olives or Mount Scopa. I think the Mount of Olives. And I had just happened to look over to my left. I was looking down at the Temple Mount across the Kidron Valley. Looked over to my left and I saw Herodium way off in the distance. Not way off, but I saw it a few miles off in the distance. So this big mound of dirt here. And that's where they ultimately found Herod the Great's sarcophagus. Talk about that probably next week. I don't think I'll get to that today. Bullet 7. Joseph, Herod's brother, joined Herod along the way to Engedi at Thressa. Now I just showed, instead of having another color, I just showed this in the color of purple, which is Herod's color. Herod's color, travels of Herod the Great, purple. Okay. Next up, Herod left 800 of the 9,000 at Masada. His close family and a few guards, he left them at Masada. This is, I think, one of the few pictures that I got of Masada when we were traveling out to Masada to look at it. My camera battery went dead on the top of Masada. Oh, man. You talk about depressing. I had an extra battery. It was down at the bottom of Masada on the bus. So the battery went dead. So this is one of the few pictures of Masada that I got. This is a giant chunk of rock in the middle of the desert. Okay, Herod left 800 of his folks there and then went off kind of skipping around town looking for help. Next up, bullet 9. Antigonus was enthroned in Jerusalem in 40 BC by the Parthians. Okay, so we start seeing a conflict between the Parthians and the Romans. Okay, because Palestine, Judea, was a very important land to have, right in the middle, like with the Ptolemies and the Seleucids and everybody else. Judea was a very important piece of land to have. So the Parthians kind of get control of Palestine, and they remain in Palestine and control of Palestine from 40 to 37 BC. Okay. So Antigonus was the puppet king under the Parthians. Bullet 10. Marissa destroyed by Pacorus of the Parthians. Bullet 11. Herod ran off to Petra. He enlisted the help of the king of Petra, of the Nabateans, Malichus I, but he refused. In the meantime, Herod's people at Masada were being besieged by Antigonus II. Now, good luck with that, right? We know that Masada, and we'll talk about this in a few weeks, we know that Masada was the final holdout of the Jews during the Jewish-Roman War. You know, when Jerusalem fell in AD 70, Masada didn't fall until 3 years later in AD 73, okay? It was a really hard place to conquer because you're up there and you just roll down a rock and you take out some people, right? I mean, it's pretty much nothing to it. You shoot an arrow from up there, you take out people, whatever. Easy place to defend, okay? So Antigonus was besieging the place, trying to get at Herod's family up on the rock, okay? In the meantime, Herod continued to Alexandria, Egypt. He saw Cleopatra, and he's Herod the Great, and you think he's Herod the Great because all the things he built and all the things that he did and the way he ruled people and whatever, but he is Herod the Great because the only man on earth that did not fall in love with Cleopatra the seventh. Right? Antony had, Julius Caesar had, almost everyone had fallen in love with Cleopatra the seventh, but Herod did not. So he went to see her, okay, and then he went on to, and Cleopatra really didn't do anything for him, except she wanted him to stay around, but he didn't. He then went on to Rome, Italy, and he was named King of the Jews by the Roman Senate and Mark Antony in 40 BC, according to Josephus. Now, Appian, a Roman historian, says it was about 39 BC, but we'll go with 40 BC, okay? So he became the named King of the Jews in 40 BC. This was good for Rome and Herod, because Herod was, they saw in Herod a good, strong ruler, okay, right? And the Romans had a problem with the Parthians. They knew that Herod could really help them out with the Parthian problem that they were starting to have. So he became King of the Jews in 40 BC. That's bullet number 13. All right. Now, as King of the Jews, he then starts and takes Judea. Remember, Judea, under the leadership in Jerusalem of Antigonus II, is under the control of the Parthians, essentially. Okay? So Herod has to clean all that out. That's what he does from BC 40 to 37 BC. Okay? So he starts by taking Judea. With the backing of Rome as a newly minted King of the Jews, he subdued all of Judea while Antigonus was a puppet king in Jerusalem. Joseph, who was Herod's brother, was killed during this time, probably about 38 BC. And we see a sickening story in Josephus where Herod went to Mount Arbel, and we went up to Mount Arbel and looked at that. But he went to Mount Arbel, and there were a bunch of Jews hiding in caves, supporters of Antigonus hiding in caves in Mount Arbel. Okay? And Herod needed to get rid of them. He needed to clean out the resistance, right? So when we went to Mount Arbel, we saw this recreation of a chest that Herod the Great used to lower down soldiers from the top of Mount Arbel to these caves below. There's a cave right there. There's some caves in there. So this is where these Jews were hiding. Very interesting place that we went. I would recommend you go to Mount Arbel when you're there. Right off, you look out across the Sea of Galilee and stuff. It's a really pretty place. Tiberias, really neat place to go. Let me tell you a story. So we had a free day. The way we did our Israel thing, we went early and did several things on our own, and then we kind of hooked up with a tour group then, and then we stayed later and did more things on our own, okay? So this was in the middle of our thing. We were hooked up with a tour group. And we had a free day one day. We were in Tiberias and said, yeah, go do what you want to do. Some people went and laid by the pool and whatever, and I'm saying, there's no way I'm going to lay by the pool. I'm in Israel. Are you crazy? And people were kind of wondering, what do we do? I don't know what we do. And I said, well, I'm not laying by the pool. We're going somewhere. So I went and rented a car. We got the last car in Tiberias, I think. And it was a stick shift. Have y'all ever driven a stick shift? Yeah, a few of you. Well, I had too, 30 years ago. I said, look, we're all in. Let's get a stick shift. So it was me and Shelley and another couple, a woman and her mom, said, we don't want to wait out the pool either. Let's go do something. So they hooked up with us, and we got this little bitty car with a stick shift, and we took off. And we saw a little sign at the rental place. It had a big circle with a line through it. Don't do this. Had a little guy falling off a cliff. And I think somewhere else we saw one with a car going off a cliff. Don't do this. Don't go off the cliff in our car. And I'm driving a stick shift for the first time in 30 years on these hills and valleys. Very exciting. I got the hang of it pretty quick, didn't I? She's not saying anything. I thought I got the hang of it pretty quick, but we survived. But anyway, I was not brave enough. The woman that we were traveling with was braver than I was, and she actually climbed down and took some pictures. And if you go to the book, you'll see her name, Shireen Lim. She took these pictures of these caves. She would walk down there and kind of hang over the edge and take some pictures. Not really, not bad. I was not brave enough to do that. I was up against the rocks screaming like a little girl, no, 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 and she was down there climbing around stuff. So I'm glad she got these pictures. I'm glad I was able to use these in the book. So anyway, Herod lowered these chests down from the top of the mountain, had hooks, and went and grabbed people in these caves and pulled them out on the rocks. They threw fire in the caves and burned them out or whatever. There's a story of a man who was in defiance of Herod and the Romans. He took his sons to the mouth of the cave and he slit their throat, each one, and threw them over one at a time, 7 kids, and then he finally killed himself and his wife, okay? But it didn't make any difference to Herod. He was going to kill them anyway. All right. Herod then took 5 cities in Judea and killed everyone there. And then after subduing all of Judea and Samaria, he set his sights on Rome. Now this is exactly what happened 108 years later when the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Vespasian took everything around Rome, and then actually Titus, his son, came and then with the legions took Jerusalem. And the reason they did that is because they could secure their supply lines. They didn't have people attacking them from outside, whatever. Everything was secure in the countryside. Herod did the same thing in 37, okay? But first, before he was going to take Jerusalem, he decided to marry Mariamne the first. She lived, or had lived, in the city he was getting ready to take. Her uncle, Antigonus II, was the one sitting on the throne in Jerusalem. How do you think she must have felt marrying Herod the Great? Probably not great. But women didn't have any rights back then. So anyway, he went and married Mariamne, and he was about to kill a bunch of her family in Jerusalem and also her uncle, Antigonus II. In AD 37, Jerusalem fell to Herod. Now from 4037, when Herod was the king of the Jews in name only, since Antigonus the second was sitting on the throne, he became the actual king of the Jews, okay, not just in name, but actually ruler in 37 when Antigonus died. Antigonus II died by being beheaded by Antony, and Jerusalem fell. Okay, so we see Jerusalem in 37 BC with the help of the Romans under the command of Gaius Sosius, acting on behalf of Mark Antony. He had 11 legions of men. A little later in the book, I talk about the Roman military, how many men were in a legion. So that's about 66,000 men. And the size of the legions varied over time, whether you're in the Roman Republic or the early empire or later empire or whatever. So this varied over time. But at this time, it's probably about 66,000 men. 6,000 horsemen, and the destruction and plunder were so great that Herod said, if you keep this up, I'm not going to have anything to rule over at all. They're just going in and decimating everything, taking all the treasure and everything. And he said, if you'll stop the plundering, I will pay your soldiers out of my pocket. So Sosius said, all right, sounds like a plan. We want you to be king over something because we need you, basically. We need you to fight off the Parthians. At this time, Antigonus was taken hostage to Rome, and Mark Antony executed him almost immediately when he showed up because Herod paid him a bunch of money. And Antony probably thought that was a good idea anyway. He probably figured if he didn't execute him, the civil war was going to keep going on, and he really needed some stability in Palestine, in Judea, because of the Parthians. Okay, he needed somebody in charge, a really strong leader in charge, to really kind of buffer the Parthians in the eastern half of this landmass. Okay. This event, when Antigonus was killed, marked the end of Hasmonean rule. Now, 2 transition points for Roman rule. In 63 BC, when Pompey and the Romans took over because of the civil war between Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. Remember that? Pompey took over Rome. He said, I'm going to turn this car around and go back, and he did. Okay? In 37 BC, when Herod the Great took over Jerusalem with the help of the Romans and eliminated the final Hasmonean. So we really do have very firm Roman control of Judea by 37 BC. Some more about Herod the Great. Herod ingratiated himself to whoever was leading at the time. We've talked about some of this already, but let me go over it again. Okay? As a young boy, Herod was appointed governor of Galilee by his father under Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was not an emperor, but he was a dictator and a consul of Rome and one of the members of the first triumvirate. We'll talk about those terminologies as we go along. Okay? So under Julius Caesar, Herod started getting his feet wet. Okay? Herod was called before Mark Antony when he was consul. Mark Antony was consul in part of the second triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus. Okay? Mariamne was not happy with her husband because Herod had killed her brother. Women. right? She was not happy. Herod had killed her brother Aristobulus III, a full-blooded Hasmonean. Okay, she sent a letter to Cleopatra. Yeah, that Cleopatra, the famous Cleopatra, and said, "Can you help me and talk to your husband Antony and get him to bring Herod before him and do an inquiry on why he decided to just kill my brother?" You know, Aristobulus was Aristobulus III was a pretty nice guy by all accounts. Why did he drown my brother on purpose? Let's get to the bottom of this. So Cleopatra did talk Antony into that, and Antony summoned Herod the Great before him. So Herod the Great went with crown in hand and a bunch of money. He also left instructions back in Jerusalem. He said, you know, if I don't come back, and this was with his uncle Joseph, to kill Mariamne if Antony ended up killing him. Herod didn't know. I mean, he was very nervous about going to Rome and talking to Mark Antony. I think it was Rome. So he went to Rome with a bunch of money and this crown in hand and left instructions for Mariamne to be killed if things did not go well. That was one occasion. A little bit later on, he left instructions again for Mariamne to be killed when he was called before Octavian. Remember Octavian, who became Caesar Augustus, one and the same, first emperor of Rome. Octavian defeated Cleopatra and Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Okay? Herod the Great had been all in with Antony. Oh, he was all in. Antony was his guy. You know, Antony had done a bunch of good things for him. Herod had done a bunch of good things for Antony. Okay? Crown in hand and money, he went to Octavian and said, I was all in on Antony. I tell you that right up front. But I can do the same thing for you. And Octavian said, all righty, let's go. Let's go forth and conquer. And Octavian reconfirmed him as king of the Jews in 30 BC. Wow, pretty cool. The birth of Jesus and Herod the Great. Now, December is probably not when Jesus was really born, because shepherds were tending their flocks, we read about in the Bible, and they typically only did this from late March to mid-November. Just a couple of points. There's other points that tell us that December is probably not the right time for him to be born. Joseph and Mary are required by the Emperor Augustus, who's Octavian, to go to Bethlehem for a census. It's very unlikely Octavian would have ordered this census in the middle of winter when it was very hard to travel. Okay? So, December is probably not likely the time. If not December, what year was it then? Okay, well, it's not 0 BC because that doesn't exist. 0 is a moment in time, and then we go from 1 BC immediately to 1 AD. Okay, we talked about week 1 in our talk. Can you remember week 1? It's been a while. That was in week 1 of our talk. We talked about BC and AD. Okay, so the Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord era calendar, was invented between 527 and 565 by this guy, and he made a miscalculation of when Jesus was born. The term BC came later, about 1627 AD. We talked about all this already. Okay, most scholars believe that Jesus was born between 7 BC and 4 BC. I'm inclined to think he was born probably 6 BC. I could be persuaded to 5 BC or whatever. Let me tell you the reasons. Herod the Great died in 4 BC. Firm point. We know that. Okay, and we know because of him killing the babies in Bethlehem. Okay, so it had to be before 4 BC. So anybody that says Jesus was born in 3 BC or AD 1 or something, I don't think they have a leg to stand on. Okay, he ordered, Herod the Great did, before he died, the massacre of all male babies in Bethlehem 2 years old and younger. So the latest Jesus could have been born is 4 BC, but most likely 6 BC. Some say 7 BC, 6 BC, or 5 BC. It's probably one of those years right there. I kind of go with the middle. Let's go with 6 BC. All right, so we'll pick up next week about Herod the Great and the babies of Bethlehem. Thank you all very much. We'll see you next week.